Hey, this is Alex Head, founder of Subtext Radio.
This is Subtext.
Please go ahead and click the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps us to reach new audiences and promote the artists that we work with. Hit like and hit subscribe.
Dressmaker. Since I was a child, I have loved clothes. They have been a creative outlet, connected me with many friends, and fascinated me intellectually too. When we were children, my mother made a lot of our clothes, and at 81, she is still making beautiful things with her hands and fabric and thread and wool. One of her favourites is crazy patchwork. Until I saw a piece in a collage exhibition recently, I didn't realise that this craziness had been going on since the 19th century, when women first began to use factory scraps to create these free-form pieces. But the family connection to textiles goes back further than that. My surname Walker comes from the weaving process and was given to those who cleaned, rolled and fulled the cloth. And on my mother's side, there are textile merchants and manufacturers in almost every branch of the family tree. My great-great-grandfather was general manager of a Manchester store that was in the main street of Melbourne, in the location where the city's major department store now is. In the 20th century, the family owned a company called Prestige that manufactured lingerie and stockings. They would also bring Holeproof to Australia for cheaper, more basic underwear and hosiery. During the Second World War, Prestige manufactured parachutes. In her teens, my mother used the leftover silk from this to make blouses with interchangeable ribbons that matched them with her skirts. Dress Act. After the Battle of Culloden, all Highland clothing was banned. Men who wore tartan or a kilt risked 6 months in jail, or on second offence could be transported to the colonies for 7 years. Amongst a population who were being forced onto ever smaller crofts to grow their subsistence, the cost of purchasing new clothing must have been crippling. A comment on the Disarming Act, which was the legal document that banned Highland clothing, stated, "The Highland garb is a dress fit only for war, theft and idleness." Similar slurs are used to this day to devalue Indigenous cultures all over the world. The Act would also take up the colonising strategy of emasculating proud men. Men who had worn kilts their whole lives complained of the discomfort and feminising effect of trousers. While the Dress Act was still in place, wealthy Londoners took a liking to Highland traditions. The rugged landscape and seemingly wild aspects of the life were consistent with romantic sensibilities, and clubs were started to celebrate Highland culture. Their campaigns to government would contribute to the ban being lifted in 1782. Handbills in both Gaelic and English were distributed across Scotland celebrating the noble character of Highland dress and the joy felt in every Highland heart at the lifting of the ban. But no Highlander had worn such garb for 40 years, and the banning of their culture had surely had a complex emotional impact. Ultimately, it was the wealthy who could afford to purchase garments that had gone from being daily wear to fancy dress. Undressed. Underexposure was a controversial photo shoot that appeared in British Vogue in June 1993. Corin Day shot then 19-year-old Kate Moss in her own apartment in London. The flat was sparsely furnished and featured little more than a basic bed and old TV. Moss wears mainly underwear, sometimes a T-shirt or pantyhose. They are from Hennies and Marks and Spencer's, not fashion labels. In commentary, assumptions were made about the lifestyle being promoted by the shoot. Was this squalor the result of kiddie porn made in a cheap hotel room, or perhaps drug addiction? Moss was accused of promoting anorexia and pedophilia. At once, Moss was considered to be too young and too knowing, innocent and degenerate at the same time. She was not allowed the humanity of her own transition into adulthood. If seen as an adult, Moss was too skinny. If seen as a child, what was she doing on the pages of Vogue in her underwear? Dress reform. The dress reform movement began in the 1850s to encourage healthier clothing for women. Corsetry, which compromised fertility, rearranged the internal organs and led to generally poorer health, was the most celebrated target. While the movement was an early example of feminist activism, both doctors and religious leaders bemoaned the health and moral indecency of tight lacing. Dress reform would lead to female sportswear, trousers for women, and warmer clothing for both genders. Reformers knew that clothing that allowed more physical movement would lead to other freedoms for women, including the ability to work for wages and ultimately to be liberated from the necessity of marriage. In the 1870s, aesthetic dress, which was influenced by the rational dress movement, became the first alternative fashion. Worn by pre-Raphaelite artists such as Lizzie Siddall and Jane Morris, the historical references to medieval and Renaissance clothing would allow for more natural body shapes and sensual styles. It would take until the 1920s and ultimately the 1960s for more women to be liberated from the crushing structures of their underwear. Dress down. Washing clothing was labour-intensive work until the 1950s. As such, many people sent their washing out. They may not have known that their clothes were washed by the slave labour of women incarcerated in Magdalena laundries. These women, who had mainly been condemned for some kind of sexual activity outside of marriage, were to wash away their sins, along with the dirt of middle-class people. The last of these institutions, which ran from the 18th century, was closed as recently as 1996. Over this period, social expectations and technology changed, but shame, burning steam, cold water, hard labour and injustice prevailed. In 2012, I had a studio in a former convent that had run such a laundry. I'd arrived believing the young women who had worked in the laundries were single mothers who had had their children taken from them, and in some cases this was true. My research would reveal a history that was more complex. The laundry had been opened in 1863 because women who resorted to prostitution in the colony, where there were few jobs for women, were utterly abandoned by the puritanical leaders of the city. Other early inmates were Irish famine orphans who were too weak to secure paid employment. During the 20th century, many inmates had been sent there for other reasons, including their parents being unable to afford them, or because a court had deemed it a better alternative to jail time. Unlike jail time, they did not know how long their sentence was, and I saw a photo from the 60s of a decrepit old woman stooped over an enormous sink washing in the laundries there. I found a devastating online chat of women relaying their experiences in the laundry, trying to find their friends and recommending useful forms of therapy. Regardless of the reasons a girl was there, shame was a vital element of the workplace. The women were denied their identities and their names were changed when they arrived. During some periods, they were so degraded that they were referred to only by numbers. They wore harsh brown dresses while they washed the pretty clothes of the girls who lived just over the river. Dressing tables. When we check our look in the mirror on the way out of the house, we are composing the image of ourselves that we will take into the day and the public realm. We're striking a pose for our own self-determination. This is the person that we will bring with us in our minds to negotiate our daily activities. But mirrors are also used against women and have been for a long time. In classical paintings, naked women gaze into mirrors so that the image can be a moral tale against vanity. Men's lust is deflected and the sin is ours. Mirrors are difficult. Their meanings are elusive and contradictory. They cannot be caught in an image. Even the advertising industry can't represent them, and they resort to grey graphics. In shopping catalogues, they are just peculiar cartoons drawn with a photographed frame. Mirrors are cold, hard, and impenetrable. To enter into a mirror is to find yourself in 7 years' bad luck or the script of a horror movie. But the horrors also exist on the surface. They flatten us so we are just images. They promise to show us how we look, but we can only see ourselves in reverse, and then we are fragmented and distorted. In the glamorous ground floors of department stores and in changing rooms, they tell us we are too tired, too fat, too vain, too poor, too greedy, too full of desire. Their capacity for revelation and the opportunity they provide for self-reflection is almost too profound for us to look at. In psychoanalysis, they refer to self-knowledge and the struggle one must overcome in order to gain it. But they reveal things that we cannot otherwise see. They are like photography. They are also like the moon, which reflects light from somewhere we cannot look directly. Reflecting against one another, they give us a glimpse of eternity. Have a good hard look at yourself, looking at yourself, looking at yourself, looking at yourself. Power dressing. Cardinal Pell has been pissing me off for as long as I can remember, although he's given others far more reason to be angry. I was back in Melbourne during his trial for sexual abuse. Surprisingly, clothing was central to the proceedings of the time. Being debated was whether he could access his own penis without an assistant to lift his incredibly heavy robe. This issue would also be raised during the appeal. The prefect of ceremonies and the sacristan would both claim it was impossible for him to move his robes. This man of cloth was so protected by the literal and metaphorical weight of his robes that his chastity was woven into them. The robes were presented as evidence. I can't help but imagine the jury dressing up in the robes in a similar way to children trying on medieval costumes in a museum. The jury, and later the High Court, would decide that indeed he could lift his robes because he is currently in jail for 2 counts of sexual assault of a child under 16 years of age. But his penis was not the only obscenity that Cardinal Pell would uncover. In his role as financier to the Vatican, directed by Pope Francis, Pell was given the job of auditing the finances of the Catholic Church. In fact, this had never been done before, and it interests me that it took 2 men from former colonies in the Southern Hemisphere to uncover more than €1 billion of money hidden in European bank accounts. Dressed to kill. The brutal way in which fashion discards last season's style for the next is a metaphor for all of capitalism. The new style will be treated with the same disdain next season, just as the environment, workers' rights and consumers' well-being are jettisoned in the name of profit. And fast fashion has become a vicious caricature of time under capitalism. Where high fashion maintained a destructive cycle of seasonal change, fast fashion has made that pace lethal and indiscriminate. But in fact, clothing helps us engage with time in a way that has been lost to us in a world where we send emails at night and eat mangoes in the dead of winter. Fashion is generally associated with rapid change and an exaggerated sense of time passing. But this extreme sense of time has become a part of our daily lives, and paradoxically, clothing allows us to access time in ways that are more like those of our ancestors. We still mark rites of passage with fashion. Wedding dresses and graduation gowns mark a ritual celebrating transition. On a more personal level, we purchase special outfits to mark a birthday or a friend's wedding. That item of clothing will always remind us of that event. Fashion allows us to experience time in its various manifestations as moment, duration and cycle. Through different styles, we engage with time's varied pace. Through fashion, we can have a sense of control and understanding of time that we do not have in reality. Our lives might lack variety and excitement, and through engaging with fashion that speaks of speed and youth, we can access that sense of time. Alternatively, we can place ourselves into a sense of consistency through classic good taste. Zeitgeist is the most obvious way we experience time through fashion. In film, this is a commonly used device to show the passing of time, signified by everyone being dressed in a style of a later era than the previous scene. We think of history in terms of changing fashions and the values they reflect. This is a public experience of time, but we also experience this on a personal level, where we can identify periods in our lives with styles we wore. In this way, fashion helps us grasp a sense of the past and change. We can also explore contradictory aspects of time by playing with styles from different eras. The past and future can both cause anxiety, but clothing is our constant companion as our lives change, and it can assist us to deal with the passing of time as well as contend with the confusion about just what time is. Dressing gowns. At the end of 2017, Sleazy men in their dressing gowns had moved from the private realm onto the front pages of newspapers and social media status updates. First, Hugh Hefner died, and then Harvey Weinstein's plethora of sexual assaults hit the news. His white-tailing bathrobe was frequently referred to by the women who had been invited to his hotel room for a party or to his office for an audition. Weinstein's body, bulging from his toweling robe, and Hefner's emaciated form draped in his burgundy dressing gown were always ready for sex. They were asking for it, shameless. They were under no pressure to hide or discipline their imperfect forms. No diets, corsetry or implants for these two. And they were not naked like the women in the voyeuristic paintings titled Vanity. They were not judged and dehumanised like the youthful Kate Moss. They were relaxed, lounging in their dressing gowns, not exposed, not yet. Cross-dressing. Straight men who wear women's clothing as sexual fetish do it for contradictory and varied reasons. Some of them envy the sensual pleasures women are allowed through fashion. They long for the opportunity to feel silk against their naked skin or the allure of a caress through a sheer stocking. They enjoy the comforting hug around the torso of a tight bodice or the way a satin-lined skirt will swish against the legs. For some, it is a way to connect with female lovers, to compare the way their bum looks in a straight skirt, or to borrow a dress for a night. By wearing women's clothing, they are one of the girls, sharing the joy of clothing and the connection it brings, pleasures mainly denied to straight men. Some men wear women's clothing because they like to be diminished to the status of a woman. They want to be objectified. They want to be ridiculous. The fact the dress doesn't fit and looks silly is a positive for them. They may enjoy having a woman tell them how bad they are at walking in high heels. Humiliation turns them on, and they think it's humiliating to be a woman. Actually, it's humiliating to be a human.